Hello everyone, and welcome back. There are moments in history when the boundary between knowledge and imagination becomes difficult to separate. Tonight, we step into a world that once felt completely logical to those who lived in it, even though it now seems strange to us. It is a world without microscopes, without laboratories, without charts of chemical reactions or medical imaging. It is a world where the body was understood through symbolism, intuition, and inherited belief. To those in medieval society, the body was not simply an arrangement of cells and systems. It was a living landscape shaped by emotions, seasons, and unseen forces. Health was understood not as a biological condition, but as a delicate harmony between internal elements. The people of this time believed that the body was governed by four fluids, known as the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each was associated with a temperament, a season, a sense of energy or heaviness. If they were balanced, one might feel well, calm, and whole. If they fell out of balance, the body or spirit could begin to falter. The idea may seem mystical now, but for the people of the time, it was not superstition. It was the closest thing they had to a grand, unifying explanation of life. Imagine living in a world where illness could not be traced to microbes or viruses, where pregnancy could not be confirmed by a test, where fevers and weakness appeared without visible cause, and sometimes without warning. Every physical experience carried mystery, and mystery invites interpretation. Without scientific instruments to measure change within the body, medieval physicians and healers learned to read the body as if it were a text filled with signs: the color of the skin, the speed of the pulse, the pattern of breathing, the tone of the voice, and especially the substances the body released. Observing the body meant observing the whole person, including their mood, their appetite, their dreams, and their fears. The body was viewed as inseparable from the spirit. A sadness could be a symptom. A burst of anger could be a sign of internal heat. The emotional state and the physical state were understood as reflections of each other. This worldview shaped not just medical theory, but daily life. Healing was not limited to herbs or treatments. It included conversation, prayer, diet, ritual, and rest. Doctors were trained in philosophy as well as diagnosis. Because understanding the body required understanding the soul, a healer was not just someone who treated symptoms, but someone who interpreted meaning, who tried to understand why the body had begun to shift out of balance. And because meaning was central, metaphors became powerful tools for interpreting health. This is the context in which medieval pregnancy tests developed. Pregnancy was not seen simply as a biological condition. It was seen as a profound transformation of the body's internal harmony, a change that touched both physical and spiritual layers of existence. Yet there was no simple or accurate way to confirm pregnancy early. Waiting was often the only option. But waiting invites anxiety, and anxiety creates room for experimentation. People wanted signs, hints, confirmations, reassurance. They searched for patterns in the body that might reveal what was hidden, and in the absence of modern knowledge, they built methods based on the belief that bodily fluids carried clues from inside the body to the outside world. Urine became one of the most important of these clues. It could be observed, collected, compared, and examined without harming the person. Its color, scent, clarity, and texture were believed to reflect the internal state of the person who produced it. It was seen as a mirror. And so, pregnancy tests of the medieval period developed around urine. Some of these tests seem strange now. Planting seeds in it, mixing it with wine, observing how it reacted with heat, light, metal, or even scent. Yet, to the people of the time, these were not random experiments. They were grounded in the belief that if new life was present inside the body's fluids would change in ways that could be observed. If we look closely, we can understand the logic. If the body is a delicate system of energies and fluids, then anything that influences new life must leave a trace. It is easy to laugh at these methods now, but the desire behind them is universal. People want to know what is happening within themselves. They want clarity, especially in moments of uncertainty. The medieval world did not have scientific validation, but it had curiosity. And curiosity is one of the most enduring human traits, and beyond curiosity, there was care. Families wanted to prepare. Communities wanted to support. Pregnant women wanted to understand their own changing bodies. The methods they used may have been symbolic, but the intentions behind them were practical and emotional. They wanted to reduce fear and replace it with knowledge, however imperfect that knowledge was. This world also shaped the roles of those who practiced medicine. Midwives, for example, learned to read the body, not through theory, but through experience. They observed countless births and pregnancies. They noticed changes in the skin, posture, appetite, and mood that often signaled pregnancy long before any ritual tested. They learned through life itself. Yet, because their knowledge was rooted in practice rather than written academic theory, they were often treated with suspicion, especially by universities and the church. The irony is clear. Those closest to real accuracy were often those least respected by formal authority. Still, the symbolic methods persisted, sometimes because of tradition, sometimes because of belief, and sometimes simply because they were the only tools available. When we look back now, the important thing is not to judge the accuracy of the methods, but to understand the mindset behind them. These practices were not foolish. They were a response to uncertainty. They were a way to hold on to control in a world where the body could be unpredictable, where life itself could feel unstable. And in that sense, the medieval world is not so different from our own. We, too, fear what we do not understand. We, too, reach for signs when answers are unclear. The difference is that we now have scientific instruments that allow us to measure what was once invisible. But the emotional core remains the same. The desire to know, to prepare, to understand what the body is telling us. As we continue exploring the history of pregnancy tests, keep this in mind. Every experiment, every ritual, every strange-sounding method came from a place of longing to understand the body more deeply. These practices are not just stories about the past. They are reminders that curiosity is timeless, and the search for knowledge is one of the most human things we do. In the medieval world, urine was not merely seen as waste. It was considered a message from within the body, a kind of internal mirror that reflected everything happening beneath the skin. To understand why urine held such a powerful role in diagnosis, we need to imagine living in a time when the inner workings of the body were completely invisible. There were no stethoscopes, no ultrasounds, no chemical tests, and certainly no microscopes. The inside of the body was a mystery, a locked room no one could enter. And so, people learned to look for clues in what the body released, in what could be seen and studied without harm. Urine became central because it felt like a direct channel between the hidden world inside and the visible world outside. It changed in color, in smell, in thickness, in clarity. It responded to diet, emotion, illness, stress, exhaustion, and pregnancy. The medieval mind believed that if the body was made of balanced humors, then urine was the overflow of those humors, meaning it carried their story. Observing urine was like reading a coded message. And even though they did not have the tools to decode it scientifically, they believed deeply that the message was there. Enter a small, rounded glass vessel known as the medulla. This vessel was not an ordinary cup, but a symbolic object that physicians carried everywhere. Its shape was specifically crafted to allow urine to settle into layers, so the healer could examine it against the light. A physician would lift the medulla slowly, rotating it, letting sunlight or candlelight catch the surface. They would look for cloudiness, floating particles, streaks of color, or sediment collecting at the bottom. They believed each feature corresponded to a different internal disturbance. The process was not casual. It had the seriousness of ritual performed with quiet attention, as if the physician were reading scripture. To the people of the time, watching a physician read urine was impressive, almost mysterious. It felt like witnessing someone translate the language of the body itself. The physician did not need to touch the patient, ask many questions, or conduct any physical examination. They simply observed what the body had already expressed. In a society where medicine was as much performance as practice, this gave the physician authority The ability to see the unseen made them seem almost otherworldly. But this belief did not arise purely from imagination. People had noticed patterns. They saw that certain illnesses made urine darker or more cloudy. They noticed that dehydration affected its concentration. They observed that certain foods or herbs changed its scent. And although they did not understand hormones, they sometimes saw subtle changes in urine during pregnancy. These observations were real, even if the explanations were not. If we move closer, we can imagine the scene inside a medieval household. A woman begins to suspect she may be pregnant. There is uncertainty, hope, fear, or a mixture of both. Time passed slowly. There is no test to purchase, no appointment to schedule, no medical laboratory. Instead, she or someone close to her may collect her urine in a small basin or vessel, carrying it to someone known for having a discerning eye. This person might be a midwife, a healer, or a physician traveling between towns. The moment of examination feels intimate, filled with anticipation. The woman watches the healer's expression carefully, searching for clues before any words are spoken. The healer lifts the medulla, holds it near the window, and studies it. Silence fills the room. Everyone waits. And in that waiting, something profoundly human happens. The test is not just about health. It is about identity, future, responsibility, and change. The uncertainty surrounding pregnancy is emotional as much as physical. And in that emotional landscape, even imperfect information feels necessary. Urine becomes the tool through which hidden knowledge might be revealed, even if the truth is only partially guessed. It is also important to understand that medieval medicine did not separate body, spirit, and emotion. They were believed to influence one another constantly. If a person was anxious, their body would show it. If they were at peace, the body would settle. Urine, in this worldview, did not reflect only physical condition, but emotional and spiritual state as well. That is why healers sometimes describe urine in poetic terms. Bright as morning sunlight, heavy as sorrow, pale as fear. Diagnosis was an art of metaphor as much as observation. As the practice of uroscopy spread, it became more structured. Physicians developed urine color charts, sometimes beautifully painted on parchment. These charts displayed shades ranging from clear water-like tones to deep amber, brown, or even red. Each shade was associated with a condition or imbalance. The charts did not reflect scientific accuracy, but they represented a growing desire to organize medical knowledge, to standardize understanding, to create shared language. In a world without laboratories, this was a step toward consistency. And while some of the conclusions drawn from urine observation were incorrect, the practice did encourage something we now recognize as scientific behavior, paying attention, observing the body repeatedly, noticing patterns over time, comparing cases, recording outcomes. The world was not yet ready for chemistry, but the seeds of empirical thinking were there. Urine became a symbol of the human attempt to understand the body through what the body already offers. It reflects a longing for clarity in uncertainty. In pregnancy, that uncertainty is especially emotional. The body changes quietly at first, almost secretly. The mind tries to interpret signals, and the heart sits suspended between possibility and the unknown. Urine testing, in this context, became a ritual of reassurance. Even if the conclusion was not accurate, the act itself created meaning, comfort, direction. There is also a deeper layer. When people examined urine, they were not only studying health, they were studying themselves. They were trying to understand what it means to live in a body that cannot be fully controlled or fully known. The act of observing urine was an act of confronting the mystery of being alive. It was a way of saying, something inside me is happening, and I want to understand it. This desire has not changed. Today, we have test strips that reveal results in minutes. We have laboratories that analyze chemical markers with precision, but the emotional moment, the waiting, the wondering, the imagining of what may come next is the same as it was centuries ago. The tools have changed, but the experience is familiar. The quiet breath held between possibility and certainty has never disappeared. The medieval world looked inward through the only window it had. Urine was that window. A simple, everyday substance became a key to mysteries that could not otherwise be touched. And though their understanding was imperfect, their curiosity was real. It was sincere. It was human. If we look closely, we can see ourselves in that curiosity, the longing to know, the fear of not knowing, the hope that a small sign might guide us toward clarity. The medieval world may feel distant, but the mind that lived inside it is not gone. It is still here, inside us. In the quiet spaces of the medieval home, where life unfolded slowly and the days were guided more by the rhythm of seasons than by clocks or schedules, one of the most intimate uncertainties was the question of pregnancy. There was no medical test, no clinical appointment, no definitive way to confirm new life early on. Instead, people looked to the natural world for signs. And among the many methods that emerged, one in particular carried both symbolic poetry and a surprising whisper of biological accuracy. It was the wheat and barley sprouting test. The instructions were simple. A woman would collect her urine, usually in the early morning, and she would pour it over two small piles of grain, one of wheat and one of barley. These grains, arranged carefully in shallow bowls or on woven cloth, would be placed near a window where sunlight could reach them. Then the household would wait. Day by day, they would watch to see whether the seeds began to sprout. To us, this may seem like a quiet and even decorative scene. Two bowls resting by a window, grains sleeping beneath a golden haze of morning light. But to the people who tended those bowls, the waiting was alive with meaning. Each morning, they would look closely. Were the grains swelling? Were tiny white roots beginning to appear? Wheat and barley were chosen not merely because they were common crops, but because they were considered seeds of life, symbols of growth, nourishment, and continuity. They were already part of everyday bread, and bread was sustenance. To use the same grains to look for new life felt natural, almost harmonious. The belief behind the test was rooted in the medieval understanding of the body. If pregnancy meant that the body was generating new life, then that new life must somehow influence everything inside the body, including the fluids it produced. So the idea emerged that urine from a pregnant woman carried some kind of life-giving essence, a warmth, an energy, or a fertility spirit, depending on the region. If the urine held this life sign, it could encourage seeds to awaken. If no new life was present, the seeds would remain still. The test was not performed by physicians alone. More often, it belonged to the realm of midwives, mothers, grandmothers, neighbors, or women themselves. It was a quiet ritual done inside kitchens, near hearths, on stone windowsills, or in courtyards where the sun struck in the late morning. There was no sense of spectacle in it. It was private, gentle, something almost tender. Of course, the interpretation of the test varied. In some communities, if the barley sprouted first, it was believed to indicate one outcome. If the wheat sprouted first, another. In certain places, people even went further and believed the type of sprout could suggest the future characteristics of the child. Not everyone agreed on these finer details, which shows how oral knowledge evolves differently across regions. But the core idea remained consistent. Growth meant pregnancy. For all its symbolic meaning, there is something particularly fascinating about this test when viewed through the lens of modern understanding. Centuries later, scientific research would discover that urine from someone who is pregnant contains increased levels of hormones, especially estrogen and HCG. And estrogen, under the right conditions, can influence the speed of germination. Not strongly. Not always, and certainly not in a way that could reliably confirm pregnancy. But just enough to explain why, over many generations, some women witnessed the seeds sprout and came to believe the test had merit. This accidental alignment between symbolism and biology is striking. It shows that medieval people were not simply inventing rituals out of imagination. They were observing patterns, sharing their experiences, and passing those experiences forward. When something appeared to work, even inconsistently, it became part of tradition. And tradition, especially in matters of the body, carries enormous strength. But beyond accuracy, what truly matters is the emotional dimension of the test. Pregnancy brings with it questions about identity, about the future, about responsibility and love. And in a world where life was unpredictable and often fragile, the hope of new life was both cherished and approached with caution. The seed test offered a moment of stillness within that uncertainty. It gave people something to watch, something to wait with, something to hold on to, while time revealed its truth. Picture the scene again. A woman rises with the sun. She pulls aside the curtain or lifts the wooden shutter, letting in morning light. She leans over the bowls, searching the grains with quiet concentration. Perhaps she notices the faintest swelling in one seed, a tiny hint of movement toward growth. Her breath holds for a moment. It may be nothing, or it may be everything. And in that moment, the room is filled with possibility. There is something deeply human in that scene. The desire to see sign. The need to understand what the body is doing. The longing to feel connected to something unfolding inside. The seed test was less about certainty and more about presence. It created a space where waiting could be shared between the woman and her own body, between the body and the world around it, between today and the future that might be approaching. Even now, with digital tests that provide results in minutes, the emotional experience of waiting does not disappear. There is still a quiet moment between not knowing and knowing. A breath held, a thought whispered, a question asked inwardly. The medieval seed bowls simply held that moment in physical form. And so, the wheat and barley test stands as an example of how deeply intertwined human bodies have always been with the natural world. For most of history, people looked to nature not just for food and shelter, but for understanding. Seeds, light, water, soil, these were not separate from the human experience. They were reflections of it. In the end, the test was less about discovering a truth and more about expressing a hope. And hope has always been one of the quiet forces guiding human hand. There is a certain atmosphere that lingers in stories of medieval life. The soft glow of candlelight, the quiet murmur of voices behind shuttered windows, the scent of herbs drying above a fire. Medicine, in those days, did not look like the crisp, sterile images we associate with hospitals today. Instead, it unfolded in kitchens, in small wooden rooms, in the presence of family and familiarity. And within that world, the wine test emerged as one of the more curious attempts to understand the mystery of early pregnancy. The test was remarkably straightforward. A woman who suspected she might be pregnant would provide a sample of her urine. The physician, or in some cases, the household caregiver, would mix it with wine. Then they would simply observe. If the mixture remained clear, she was believed to be pregnant. If it turned cloudy, thick, or altered in color, the assumption was that no pregnancy was present. Some descriptions said the reaction would be immediate. Others advised waiting hours. And so the ritual went, a liquid held up to light, a moment of judgment, and then a pronouncement. At first glance, it may seem almost whimsical, like a folk practice invented without thought. But to people of the Middle Ages, the reasoning behind this test felt logical, even elegant. Wine was considered a pure substance, cleansed by fermentation and touched by the sacred nature of grapes. In religious symbolism, wine appeared again and again as a symbol of life, purity, and spiritual connection. To mix something with wine was, in a sense, to reveal its truth. If the urine remained harmonious with the wine, then it must contain something pure, something new. This belief was not only cultural, but deeply emotional. For medieval people, pregnancy was more than a physical state. It was a sign of hope, continuation, and blessing. The idea that one could detect such a state through a substance as symbolic as wine added a kind of ritual beauty to the process. This was not merely a test. It was almost a reflection of faith. The space where the test took place also mattered. Sometimes it was performed in a quiet room with a single candle lit, the flame trembling softly in the air. Other times it was done in the presence of a midwife or healer, a woman whose hands had delivered many lives and who understood more through experience than through books. The act of mixing the wine and urine might have been accompanied by murmured prayers, thoughtful silence, or simply the steady breathing of someone waiting for an answer their life might hinge upon. One can imagine the emotional weight of that waiting. A woman watching the bowl or cup would not just be looking for clarity, she would be watching her future form itself. Would she become a mother? Would her life change? Would her household shift to make way for new responsibilities, new joys, new fears? In a time when life was fragile, every pregnancy carried both promise and risk. And yet, it was still a moment where hope could be held carefully in the hands. Interestingly, modern scientists revisiting this method centuries later found that there may have been a faint biological truth supporting the medieval belief. Alcohol can interact with certain proteins and hormones in urine, and those levels do change during pregnancy. While the wine test was far from reliable, it might have occasionally shown subtle differences that reinforced confidence in the practice. And once something appears to work, even rarely it tends to endure through repetition and memory. But perhaps the more compelling part of this story is what it reveals about how medieval people approached uncertainty. Without the tools of modern science, they relied on what they had: observation, symbolism, intuition, and shared knowledge. The wine test was part of a world where understanding flowed from experience rather than measurement, from metaphor rather than data. And in many ways, there is something gentle in that approach. Yet we should also acknowledge something else. In this period, not everyone who performed such tests was gentle or wise. Some physicians held great confidence but little knowledge. Some interpreted results based on personal judgment rather than careful observation. And sometimes the emotional vulnerability of women facing these tests was exploited or misunderstood. But alongside these missteps existed the steady presence of midwives, women who cared deeply, who listened, who watched, who guided. Midwives often used the wine test not as a definitive answer, but as a conversation starter. They observed the woman's body, her energy, her appetite, her mood, and then the test simply added another piece to the picture. To them, the human body was something to be known through patience and closeness, not through single moments. When we imagine this scene, it becomes quieter, more human. A woman sits, hands folded. A midwife leans over a bowl, her expression thoughtful. A candle flickers. Outside, wind moves through trees or across rooftops. The world is still waiting alongside them. The mixture rests. Maybe it is clear. Maybe it is not. But in either outcome, something important happens. The woman is seen. Someone is witnessing her uncertainty, her hope, her fear. And that, perhaps, is where the real meaning of these tests lies. They created space for women to be acknowledged at a moment when the future felt fragile and internal and invisible. The wine test was not diagnostic in the way we now understand diagnosis. If it was an emotional gesture shaped into a physical form, the act itself said, your question matters. Your body matters. Your future matters. We will face this unknown together. Even now, the moment before a modern test result appears carries that same stillness, that same breath held, that same quiet. The technology has changed. The experience has not, and perhaps that is why these medieval practices are worth remembering, not for their accuracy, but for their humanity. Among medieval methods of detecting pregnancy, few are as memorable or as symbolically revealing as the onion or garlic breath test. To us, it may sound unusual, even humorous, but within the world that created it, this test was rooted in a deeply held belief about how the body worked, one that blended physical observation with a poetic, almost mystical view of human anatomy. The result was a practice that is both strange and surprisingly intimate, a moment of quiet, searching for answers in a time without modern knowledge. And to understand this test, we must step back into the worldview of the Middle Ages. In that time, the body was not seen as a system of organs and tissues interacting through chemical and electrical signals. Instead, it was imagined as a network of pathways through which breath, warmth, and vitality flowed. People believed that the body was connected by channels, interior, rivers, and winds that carried life itself. The womb, in particular, was seen as a central but mysterious space, something both powerful and unpredictable. The idea behind the onion and garlic breath test was simple. If a woman inserted a clove of garlic or a small peeled onion overnight, then the following morning, someone would check her breath. If the smell of garlic or onion reached the mouth, the belief was that the internal pathway was open, meaning the woman was not pregnant. If no scent traveled upward, it meant the womb was closed, holding new life inside. This was not seen as invasive or strange at the time. To medieval physicians, healers, and midwives, this was a test of airflow. They believed the womb could breathe, and that it shared a direct pathway with the chest and head. So, if air could travel inward or upward, it meant the body was still free. If air did not move, it meant something was present, something growing. The reasoning may seem fantastical today, but it reveals something honest about medieval thinking. They were not indifferent. They were simply trying to understand something with the tools they had: observation, pattern, and metaphor. They saw the breath as the essence of life. And so they interpreted the presence or absence of scent as proof of something unseen taking shape. The setting for this test varied from household to household, but it nearly always took place privately. There was no audience, no ritual of public judgment. It was usually a quiet moment, shared between a woman and someone she trusted, perhaps a midwife, perhaps a spouse, perhaps a mother or sister. The test did not require wealth, equipment, or specialized training. It required only patience and closeness, two qualities that often guided women's knowledge of their own bodies. Imagine the scene. A room lit by lantern or candle, night settling outside the window, the air cooling as the hearth fire burns low. A woman rests, waiting for morning to come. She is not waiting for the test result alone. She is waiting for clarity. Clarity about her life, her body, her next steps. The hush of the night is thick around her. Time moves slowly. And in that stillness, her thoughts may wander, hopes rising, fears whispering, memories unfolding. The next morning, the moment of truth is simple. Someone leans in, gently, respectfully. They breathe near her face, not with judgment, but with attention. If there is the faintest trace of garlic or onion on her breath, the conclusion is made. If there is none, a different conclusion is drawn. No matter the result, the moment itself carries weight. It is a moment of being seen. In an age where much of a woman's life was shaped by expectations and obligations, the onion test is quietly revealing. It shows that women, families, and midwives sought ways to understand and prepare. It shows they were not passive. They were searching for knowledge, even if that knowledge was incomplete or filtered through symbolic language. And just as importantly, it shows that women often shared these moments with other women, not in spectacle, but in quiet companionship. There is tenderness in that. But there is another side to the story. Because medieval medicine was not uniform. Knowledge varied from region to region. And while midwives tended to use such tests with care and respect, there were physicians who approached them with more authority than understanding. Some doctors used the onion test as an opportunity to declare certainty where none existed. Others used it to reinforce their own status as interpreters of the body and destiny. And in such hands, the test could become less about understanding and more about control. Still, the onion and garlic test endured for centuries. Not because it always worked. Modern science has shown that scent does not reliably travel through the body in the way medieval people imagined, but because it offered something rare, a way to turn an invisible question into a visible sign. It transformed uncertainty into something that could be observed, even if imperfectly. And perhaps more importantly, it created a space for reflection. Because early pregnancy is not only a physical experience, it is a psychological one. It brings forward questions of identity, responsibility, relationships, and future. In medieval times, when survival was fragile and families depended on each member for labor, the arrival of a new life was both joyous and serious. A child meant hope. A child also meant work, risk, and change. The test held all of these emotions at once. Picture, again, the quiet morning, the soft breath, the search for meaning in something as delicate as a scent. This was not only a diagnostic moment, it was a human moment. much like today. For even now, when pregnancy tests can give an answer in minutes and medical systems can provide clarity with laboratory precision, the emotional journey remains deeply personal. There is still a moment of waiting. There is still a breath held. There is still the quiet turning inward to ask, what will this mean for me, for my life, for the shape of the days ahead? The onion test reminds us that throughout history, people have reached for understanding in the same way through touch, breath, time, and presence. What changes is the method. What never changes is the heart. To truly understand medieval pregnancy tests, we have to understand the worldview behind them. And at the center of that worldview was a belief that shaped centuries of medical practice, storytelling, and emotional understanding of the body. The idea that the womb was not anchored in place, but wandering. In medieval thought, the womb was not a stable organ. It was alive, reactive, and capable of movement. Physicians, scholars, and healers believed it could shift upward toward the chest, press against the heart, or even rise toward the throat. When a woman experienced breathlessness, anxiety, faintness, or sudden mood changes, the explanation given was simple and entirely confident. The womb was roaming, searching, unsettled. This belief did not appear suddenly in medieval Europe. It had deep, ancient roots. In classical Greece, philosophers described the womb as a creature within a creature, an animal living inside a woman's body. They wrote that the womb responded to neglect or sorrow, that it could become restless. It needed balance, affection, nourishment, and equilibrium. Over centuries, this idea traveled across cultures, changing in tone and nuance, but never disappearing. By the time it reached the Middle Ages, it had become a guiding principle of women's health. The womb, they believed, was guided not only by anatomy, but by emotion and experience. If a woman felt sadness for too long, the womb could rise. If she experienced shock or loss, the womb might retreat. If she lacked warmth, comfort, or connection, the womb could wander upward to seek what was missing. This may sound poetic, and it is, but medieval people did not see it as metaphor. They believed it literally. So how did this belief connect to pregnancy tests? If the womb could move, then pregnancy required the womb to stay in place. A womb holding new life was thought to be weighted, grounded content. A womb that wandered was empty. And so many medieval pregnancy tests were not just attempts to detect pregnancy, they were attempts to determine the behavior of the womb. This is why scent played such a large role. If pleasant smells were placed near the pelvis, oils, herbs, flowers, the womb was believed to be coaxed downward, returning to where life begins. If sharp smells were held near the nose, vinegar, smoke, garlic, the womb would retreat from them and return to its rightful place. The goal of these techniques was to persuade and soothe the womb back into balance. And if the womb did not respond, then perhaps it was anchored because life had already begun. We can see this belief in the onion and garlic test. Inserting the scent near the womb and checking the breath was more than a method of detection. It was a dialogue with the womb. If the smell reached the mouth, they believed the pathway was open, meaning no pregnancy. If the scent stayed contained, the womb must be settled, holding life. The wandering womb belief was also used to explain emotional experiences. If a woman became withdrawn, anxious, or tearful, the diagnosis was not psychological, but physical. The womb had risen toward the heart, generating emotional storms. If she felt short of breath, the womb was believed to have moved near the lungs. Even laughter or weeping without apparent cause could be traced back to the restlessness of the womb. In this way, medieval society turned the womb into a storyteller of the inner life. And though the belief was inaccurate anatomically, there is something deeply human about it. It recognized that emotions and the body are connected, that grief can sit heavy in the chest, that fear can make breathing shallow, that longing can change how the body feels. Modern medicine used different language, hormone, nervous system, psychological stress, but the emotional truth remains. The medieval explanation was simply shaped through metaphor and intuition rather than physiology. Of course, not all interpretations of the wandering womb were gentle. At times, this belief was used to dismiss women's emotional lives, implying that women were controlled by their own body. Some writings from the period describe the womb as unpredictable, sensitive, even difficult. These descriptions sometimes reinforce the idea that women needed guidance, confinement, or authority. And yet, the same belief made midwives deeply attentive to subtle emotional changes. They listened more closely than many physicians did. They looked into the eyes, watched the breath, observed the tone of voice, the posture, the rhythm of movement. In this way, the wandering womb belief shaped both misunderstanding and empathy. Consider a winter evening in a medieval village. The wind outside is cold, rattling wooden shutters. Inside, a hearth fire burns low. A woman sits beside a midwife, an elder who has delivered many children, who has seen joy and loss, who carries the memory of countless births. The woman explains that she feels a heaviness in her chest, a flutter in her heartbeat, a sense of being unsettled. The midwife listens not with clinical detachment, but with presence. She places her hand softly on the woman's abdomen. She does not rush. She does not judge. She suggests warm cloths, gentle breathing, scent near the lower body, and openness near the face. Her understanding is shaped by the world she knows, but her care, her attention is timeless. The belief that the womb could move gave meaning to sensations that otherwise would have been frightening. It offered explanations in an era where explanations were scarce. It helped women feel that their bodies were communicating rather than simply acting against them. And while the anatomical model was incorrect, the emotional insight that the body and feelings are deeply connected remains true even now. Today, when someone says they feel a weight on their chest during grief, or butterflies in the stomach when nervous, we accept that the body expresses emotion. The medieval explanation was simply a different language for the same truth. The wandering womb belief also teaches us something important about how people made sense of mystery. Before microscopes, before anatomy charts, before hormonal science, the human body was a landscape of unknowns. And humans do not tolerate unknowns easily. So we create stories. Stories help us navigate uncertainty. Those stories help us bear fear. Stories guide us to care for each other. The medieval womb may not have walked through the body as they imagined. But the story of the womb held an understanding that feels deeply human, that the body responds to emotion, that care matters, and that life within the body, whether physical or emotional, is powerful and deserving of attention. So when we look back on these beliefs, we do not do so to laugh or dismiss. We look back to understand how people loved, feared, hoped, and healed in a world without the knowledge we now take for granted. Because the history of medicine is not only the history of science, it is also the history of human attempts at tenderness. There is a certain quiet that settles over a room when a single candle is lit. The soft glow draws attention inward. Shadows soften. Time seems to slow its pace. In the medieval world, where silence and night held a deeper presence than they do today, the candle was not simply a source of light, it was a symbol of clarity, truth, and the unseen forces that shaped life. So it is little surprise that one of the most enduring medieval pregnancy tests relied on the flicker of a candle flame. The candle test was simple to perform, yet it carried a sense of ceremony. A bowl of urine was placed upon a table, usually wooden, sometimes stone, often near a hearth where the air moved slowly. A single candle was lit and held above the bowl. The observer, whether a midwife, a healer, or a family member, would watch the flame closely. If the flame flickered, wavered, or danced, as though caught in an invisible breeze, the woman was believed to be pregnant. If the flame remained steady, the conclusion was other. To medieval observers, this was not mere chance. They believed the body released invisible vapors, subtle signs of new life forming. These vapors, they thought, would rise and interact with the flame, causing it to move. The candle, therefore, became a window into the body, a way to see what the eyes could not yet see. It was a moment where the physical world seemed to meet the spiritual, one where silence and flame worked together to form meaning. Imagine the room where this test took place. The shutters likely drawn. The room quiet, except for the soft settling of the building's beams, or the faint sounds of night just beyond the walls. The woman being observed may be sitting nearby, hands folded in her lap, gaze lowered not from shame but from the weight of possibility. Pregnancy in medieval society was not just a personal matter, it carried implications for family, community, labor, and even survival. New life was both hope and responsibility, and waiting for clarity was not a small thing. And so, the candle flame became a symbol not just of detection, but of anticipation. A moment suspended between what is known and what is yet to be known. The person holding the candle, often a midwife, played a quiet but essential role. Midwives were the guardians of life's thresholds: birth, illness, recovery, and sometimes loss. They learned from observation, experience, and shared memory rather than formal education. To them, the candle test was not a trick or illusion. It was a tool, one piece among many, in a practice built on close listening and careful watching. A midwife's expertise was not in the candle alone, but in the silence around it. She watched the woman's breathing, her posture, the look in her eyes, the tone of her voice. The flame was only one part of the conversation. The test did not always produce the same result. Of course, drafts of air, humidity, the subtle movements of a hand, all could influence the flicker. But even that variability held meaning. The medieval mind did not always require consistency to believe something meaningful was happening. They did not see the world as mechanical. They saw it as alive, responsive, full of signs. In their understanding, the candle did not simply react to air. It reacted to presence. There is something profoundly human in this. When we face uncertainty, when we are waiting for news or hoping for clarity, our hearts often turn to symbols. A candle flame can feel like a messenger. A breath held has weight. A moment of silence has depth. The medieval candle test gave shape to that emotional experience. But beyond emotion, there is something else worth noticing. The candle test framed pregnancy not as a distant medical fact, but as a mystery unfolding, something sacred and unseen taking form. The flame flickering was not merely a sign of life, as it was the world whispering back that something quiet and extraordinary was happening inside the body. Even today, modern pregnancy tests, efficient, clinical, immediate, do not erase that sense of mystery. There is still the moment before the result. A pause, a breath, a private silence. The candle test simply made that moment visible. One can imagine evenings in which this quiet ritual offered comfort. A woman who feared she was alone in her uncertainty might feel supported simply by the presence of another person leaning close, watching the same flame, waiting with her. In a world where many experiences, especially women's experiences, were expected to be endured quietly, the candle test created a small space of shared attention. Of course, there were times when the test was used differently. The authority of physicians varied. In some households, the candle test became a performance of certainty, someone claiming knowledge, making pronouncements, creating clarity where the world offered none. But even then, the power of the flame often softened the moment. The candle did not shout. It moved gently, slowly, speaking in the language of light. There is also a symbolic thread that runs through the test: fire as truth. In many cultures, flame reveals what is hidden. A light in darkness exposes what cannot be seen otherwise. The medieval world did not think of pregnancy as something purely physical. It believed pregnancy was an unfolding of both body and spirit. The candle flame reflected that belief, the idea that life carries a quiet radiance even before it becomes visible. If we step into that worldview for a moment, not to adopt it, but to understand it, we see a world trying to make sense of life through metaphor, sensation, and attentiveness. People were not careless or irrational. They simply worked with what they had. And what they had was observation, connection, and trust in symbols. In many ways, the candle test reveals a tenderness in medieval life that often goes unnoticed. The image of a small room lit only by one flame. Two figures, leaning close. The world outside, hushed. A future being waited for, not rushed, not forced. Simply watched for, gives us a glimpse into the quiet depth that lived beneath the surface of everyday existence. The test itself may not have been accurate by modern standards. But the moment it created of stillness, presence, and shared witnessing remains familiar. Anyone who has ever waited for news knows the feeling. Anyone who has ever watched a flame knows the way uncertainty can settle into awe. In the end, the candle test reminds us that while knowledge changes, the experience of hoping, waiting, and wondering does not. And it is in that human continuity across centuries, across cultures, across lives that we find meaning worth remembering. To understand the medieval mind, we must remember that the boundaries between science, philosophy, and wonder were not yet separate fields. They were threads of one fabric woven together, sometimes tangled, but always sincere. In this world, metal was not just metal. It held meaning. Lead, tin, bronze, silver, each carried its own symbolism, spirit, and character. People believed metals responded to the unseen forces of life itself. So it is no surprise that one of the most intriguing medieval pregnancy tests involved letting urine interact with metal surfaces and then watching for change. The test was simple in its steps. A woman's urine was collected and poured over a piece of metal, commonly lead or tin, and the observer would wait. If the metal darkened, discolored, tarnished, or reacted in some way, it was taken as a sign that the woman was pregnant. If the metal remained unchanged, the conclusion was that no pregnancy was present. But beneath this simplicity lay something deeper. Medieval healers believed that pregnancy introduced a subtle transformation in the body, a shift in the essence or inner state of a person. And they believed that metals, being fundamental elements of the earth, could perceive this change. So the metal test was not only diagnostic, it was symbolic. It was an act of listening to the world through physical matter. To them, metal was patient and steady, something that revealed truth slowly. Watching it meant learning to wait, to notice small differences in color, sheen, or reaction. In a world without rapid answers, patience itself was a form of wisdom. Imagine the setting where this test took place. A workshop, perhaps. Or the corner of a kitchen table. The metal might have been a sheet saved from the making of tools, or a polished fragment passed down from family to family. The urine, collected quietly, is poured with care. Then time becomes the main participant. Hours pass. The light changes in the room. Someone checks the metal again, observing how the surface catches the glow of the doorway or the fire. This was not a moment of urgency. It was a moment of watchfulness. And yet, the emotional weight behind the watching was real. For pregnancy in medieval life was not simply a personal event. It shaped households, farms, work, and the future. A child brought continuation, another set of hands, another life to carry the memory of those who came before. But it also meant vulnerability. The medieval world was not one of certainty. It was one of seasons, storms, harvests, and chance. So the question of new life was layered with hope, responsibility, and quiet courage. The metal test became a way of approaching that question gently, not rushing it, not forcing an answer, simply letting time and the world reveal whatever truth was unfolding. There was also another influence shaping this, test alchemy. Not the stereotype of alchemy as a hunt for gold, but the older, quieter alchemy that saw the world as filled with relationships between elements. The medieval alchemist believed that the natural world spoke a language of transformation. Fire changed, water softened, metal shifted, air carried signs. Everything was connected. So when a midwife or healer poured urine over metal, she was participating in a conversation between the human body and the earth itself. If metal changed, it meant life was stirring. If it remained still, the world had not yet shifted. This view may not match anatomical knowledge today, but it expresses something profound, a belief that the human body is part of the larger world, not separate from it. The medieval mind did not draw a sharp line between the self and the earth. The body was made of the same elements as soil, water, and flame. Life flowed through everything. Modern science has found that pregnancy does change the chemical signature of urine, hormones rise, proteins shift. These changes could, under certain environmental conditions, cause metals to oxidize differently. The medieval observer may not have understood why, but they recognize patterns. When something appears to work even occasionally, tradition protects it. Stories carry it forward. Hands teach it to new hands. So the test endured, but beyond its possible physical effects, the test also reflected emotional truth. The waiting, the watching, the gentle attention, it all speaks to the way people faced uncertainty together. A midwife sitting beside a woman, a sister keeping watch, a husband placing a hand on the table but saying nothing. The silence held, meaning the space held care. We often imagine medieval life as harsh, fast, or unfeeling, but moments like these remind us that people then, as now, moved slowly when something mattered. They created rituals of attention when the heart was unsteady. The metal test also reveals something about how medieval people understood change. To them, life did not announce itself in large gestures. It arrived quietly, slowly, almost shyly, like a seed sprouting, or a flame flickering, or metal darkening just slightly in the slant of afternoon light. They believed life whispered before it spoke, and so they watched for whispers. Even now, in the age of instant information, we recognize that whispers still matter. Someone waits for a message, a medical result, a decision, and there is always that moment before knowing, a pause, a breath, a stillness that feels stretched across time. Whether someone watches a plastic test strip turn color or watches a candle flame dance, the emotional rhythm remains. The medieval metal test may no longer be used, but what it represents endures. The human need to understand the body, the desire to listen for change, the quiet bravery in waiting for life to reveal itself. It is not necessary to agree with the medieval interpretation to feel the humanity in the scene. A piece of metal, a bowl, a woman waiting for her future to take shape, someone sitting with her so she does not wait alone. There is tenderness there, a tenderness that has traveled through centuries, from candlelit rooms to bright mornings, from whispered traditions to modern knowledge, from uncertainty to understanding. The methods change. The waiting does not, the hope does not, the heart does not. In the medieval world, knowledge did not belong only to the waking mind. People believed that truth spoke in dreams just as clearly as in daylight. Night was not a time of absence, but a time of guidance. While the body rested, the spirit was thought to travel inward, moving through memories, emotions, and hidden knowing. Dreams were messages, not random, not accidental, but reflections of the deepest layers of the self. And so, when it came to matters as mysterious and delicate as early pregnancy, some turned to dreams to reveal what the eye could not yet see. The key test grew out of this belief. The method was simple, but the meaning behind it carried weight. A woman who wondered whether she was pregnant would take a small iron key, sometimes old and worn smooth from years of use, and place it under her pillow before sleeping. In some places, the key was wrapped in cloth. In others, it was left uncovered, believed to speak more clearly that way. The woman would then go to sleep with a quiet intention to let her dreams show her the truth. The next morning, she or someone close to her would help interpret the dream she remembered. If she dreamed of holding something small and living a bird, a lamb, a bundle, carried gently, this was taken as a sign of pregnancy. If she dreamed of keys, doors, or locks opening, this suggested the womb was preparing to welcome life. But if she dreamed of doors closed, or keys lost, or rooms she could not enter, the meaning was read in the opposite direction. The key itself symbolized transition, a doorway between what is known and what is hidden, a bridge between the waking and dream worlds. To sleep with a key beneath the pillow was to ask the body to speak, not through symptoms or signs, but through images, shapes, and feelings moving quietly across the inner sky of the mind. What makes this practice remarkable is not whether it worked, but the way it treated the woman's own experience as meaningful. The body was not something distant or mysterious to be solved only by experts. It was something the woman herself could listen to. The dream test said, in its own symbolic language, "You already know more than you realize. Trust what rises from within." In many households, the dream test was done privately. No audience. Not instruments, just a pillow, a key, and the quiet of the night. But sometimes, especially in villages where midwives held wisdom gathered across decades, the interpretation was shared. A midwife would sit beside the woman in the morning, listening carefully not only to the words of the dream, but to the tone of her voice, the pace of her breathing, the expression in her eyes. These conversations were not rushed. The midwife would ask gentle questions. What did you see first? Was the dream quiet or full? Did you feel alone or accompanied? Did you wake with heaviness or with peace? The dream itself mattered, but so did the emotional atmosphere surrounding it. Medieval medicine understood that the body and the inner life were woven together, not separate systems, but one continuous field of experience. If a woman dreamed of nurturing, of holding, of tending something delicate, midwives believed it reflected the body preparing for change. If she dreamed of loss or confusion, they believed it reflected fear, not necessarily the absence of pregnancy, but the presence of uncertainty. This gave the dream test a soft, human quality. It was not a test of accuracy so much as a moment for listening. The key under the pillow also carried another meaning. Keys were powerful symbols in everyday life. They protected homes. They opened storerooms. They guarded valuable. To sleep with a key close to the heart meant sleeping with the symbol of responsibility, change, and future. If new life was beginning, the woman would soon hold new responsibilities. The dream test allowed her to imagine this future before it arrived, to step toward it emotionally, not only physically. The medieval world moved at a slower pace than ours. Days unfolded according to light and season. Nights stretched across the landscape like long rivers of quiet thought. In such a world, the dream test made sense. Night was not just rest, it was reflection. Without artificial light, without constant noise, dreams carried weight because life allowed space for them to be remembered. We can imagine the scene. A small room, lit only by moonlight filtering through a shutter or by the warm ember glow of the hearth. A woman lies with her hand resting lightly near her pillow, aware of the key beneath it, feeling its presence without touching it. She closes her eyes. Outside, wind moves softly. Somewhere, a distant animal calls. The house settles into stillness. She breathes slowly. Sleep comes. In the dream. Shapes form, perhaps familiar, perhaps strange. Maybe she walks through a field. Maybe she holds something warm in her arms. Maybe she stands before a doorway. The dream does not rush. It unfolds in its own gentle tempo. And when morning comes, she opens her eyes, remembering what she can. She touches the pillow, feeling the shape of the key. She breathes. She waits. Whether or not the interpretation is correct, something important has happened. She has turned her attention inward. She has listened to her own body, her own emotions, her own quiet hopes or fears. And someone else, midwife, mother, friend, listens with her. This is not just testing. It is companionship. Modern medicine would tell us that dreams cannot reliably detect pregnancy. But the point of the dream test was never reliability. It was intimacy. It was creating a space where a woman's experience mattered, where her inner world was treated as meaningful, where her feelings were allowed to speak. The key under the pillow was a doorway into self-understanding. Even today, when pregnancy tests can give a clear answer in moments, the emotional pause remains. The moment of waiting, of imagining, of wondering, this has not changed. The medieval dream test simply placed that moment at the center of the experience, instead of at the edge. And perhaps there is something valuable in that. Because knowing is not only a matter of information, it is also a matter of readiness. The body may know before the mind accepts. The heart may imagine before the facts unfold. The dream test gave space for that unfolding. It allowed room for quiet. And quiet is often where truth becomes clear. As medieval pregnancy tests spread across villages, towns, monasteries, and marketplaces, another presence observed them quietly, thoughtfully, and sometimes critically: the church. In the medieval world, religion was not simply something practiced. It shaped how people understood life, illness, family, responsibility, and fate. The church was a guide, a teacher, a voice of authority. And because pregnancy touched on the most profound mysteries of existence, creation, lineage, blessing, and survival, the church paid close attention to how people tried to detect its beginnings. And for many in the clergy, the idea of using seeds, metals, candles, or dreams to determine pregnancy seemed to approach knowledge through channels that were not entirely divine. Some church leaders worried that these practices made people try to see what was not meant to be seen too soon. In their view, the early stages of life unfolded in a hidden, sacred space, protected, unspoken, untouched. Ways to rush towards certainty, they believed, was to disturb the natural unfolding of time. There was also the concern that seeking signs in objects, grain, wine, onion, keys, might blur the distinctions between faith and superstition. To the medieval church, the world was full of meaning, but meaning was grounded in divine order. If one sought answers in objects rather than prayer or reflection, it could appear to shift trust away from the sacred. Yet the situation was not simple. The church was not a single, unified voice, and its relationship with everyday life varied across regions and communities. Some priests saw these tests as harmless, soft rituals of reassurance that helped families understand themselves. Others viewed them cautiously, believing that knowledge should unfold slowly and that uncertainty could carry its own grace. In many villages, the church and midwives worked side by side. A midwife might help deliver a child one day and attend Sunday Mass the next, her hands carrying the stories of life while her heart carried her faith. There was no contradiction in this. Life was not divided into compartments. Faith flowed into daily rhythms: planting, harvesting, birth, illness, and mourning. And so for many communities, the pregnancy tests were simply part of the tapestry of existence, woven between prayer, tradition, and shared wisdom. However, there were times when the church grew uneasy. Consider the nature of prediction. If someone sought certainty too early, before the body had begun to show any outward sign, it could feel like stepping beyond the human role into a realm reserved for the divine. Life was viewed as a mystery given, not chosen, and mystery was to be respected. The church preached patience. It encouraged people to see time not as something to conquer, but as something to move through with humility. Waiting was not just waiting, it was spiritual practice. To wait was to trust. And in this sense, some church leaders believed pregnancy should be revealed not by tests, but by the slow, natural unfolding of the body. Yet people are human. They worry. They hope. They fear. And these emotions do not always respond to sermons or ideals. When someone is unsure about the possibility of new life beginning within them, time can feel heavy. The days stretch. Thoughts circle. Each small change, real or imagined, feels like a message. The medieval world offered few ways to speak to that uncertainty. And so the pregnancy tests filled a need the church could not entirely replace. This created a quiet tension, not a battle, not a dramatic conflict, but a subtle difference in how people believed answers should arrive. It was a conversation between two forms of wisdom, spiritual patience and practical understanding. Both had value. Both were rooted in care. There were also broader questions beneath the surface. The church held beliefs about the body, the soul, and when life began. But these beliefs, too, were shaped by time, region, and interpretation. And so while some religious voices discouraged these tests, others tolerated them, or even saw them as part of the natural search for understanding. Meanwhile, midwives, mothers, and healers continued to use the tests quietly, not to challenge authority, but to support one another. These practices were not acts of rebellion. They were acts of concern, companionship, and the desire to reduce fear. They gave women a sense of agency in a world where many aspects of life, work, marriage, childbirth were shaped by structures beyond their control. In truth, the conflict was not between the church and the people. It was between two different ways of knowing. One way said, "Let time reveal what it will. Trust in the unfolding of life. Allow the mystery to remain sacred." The other said, We live in these bodies every day. We feel their changes. We deserve to understand what is happening inside us. Neither way of knowing was wrong. Both were responses to the same truth, that life begins quietly, invisibly, and we cannot see it until something within reveals itself outwardly. Even today, we experience this tension. We live in a world of tests, scans, and measurements, yet the emotional experience of early pregnancy is still shaped by waiting. Science can give answers, but it cannot remove the quiet pause before knowing, or the deep personal introspection that comes with that pause. The mystery remains, not because we lack knowledge, but because life, at its core, resists being reduced to certainty. If we look back at the medieval pregnancy tests through this lens, they become something more than curious custom. They become expressions of human longing. The longing to understand one's own body, to prepare for change, to feel connected to what may be forming within. The church asked people to trust time. Midwives asked people to trust themselves. Both, in their own ways, were asking for patience. The tests themselves were neither entirely right nor entirely wrong. They were simply part of the human story, one of many ways people have tried to bridge the distance between the seen and the unseen. And if we listen closely, we can still hear that same hope echo now. When we look back at medieval pregnancy tests from our modern vantage point, the first reaction is often amusement or disbelief. Seeds sprouting in bowls, candles flickering above liquid, keys hidden beneath pillows, onions placed to test the movement of scent on the surface. These practices seem distant from the precise methods of today. We have laboratory strips, digital screens, and biochemical markers that can confirm pregnancy in minutes. The medieval world worked with shadows and symbols. We work with data and measurement. Yet, if we look more closely, if we allow curiosity to soften judgment, a more interesting truth begins to appear. Some of these ancient methods, though wrapped in metaphor and shaped by the worldviews of their time, were responding to patterns that would not be scientifically explained until centuries later. They were, in a quiet way, early signs of observation. Early attempts to notice, record, and make meaning from the body's subtle changes. The grain sprouting test, for instance, relied on wheat and barley seeds being watered with urine. To medieval eyes, the logic was symbolic. If new life was forming inside the body, that life energy might encourage seeds to awaken as well. But what they could not have known is that pregnancy introduces hormonal shifts, especially in estrogen levels, that can, under certain conditions, influence the germination process. The effect is inconsistent and unreliable, certainly not enough to serve as a dependable test. Yet the connection is real. And this real, faint thread between belief and biology gives the test a kind of quiet dignity. It shows that even when knowledge was limited, observation was present. People noticed small consistency. Patterns that appeared again and again became tradition. Tradition became shared knowledge, and shared knowledge became the memory of a culture. In the same way, the wine test was rooted in meaning that touched both daily life and spiritual symbolism. But when a woman's urine was mixed with wine and observed, something subtle sometimes occurred, not because of symbolism alone, but because urine chemistry does change with pregnancy. Alcohol can interact with protein compounds differently depending on hormonal composition. Medieval healers did not know the names of those compounds. They did not know the language of molecules, but they noticed change. And noticing is the first step towards science. The candle flame test, too, reflects a keen awareness of the body. Medieval people believed that pregnancy created subtle vapors, changes in warmth, energy, or breath that would rise and affect the flame. Today, we would not explain the flame's movement this way, yet we know that the human body does, in fact, emit changes in temperature, moisture, and scent during early pregnancy. These changes are invisible unless one pays very close attention. And that is exactly what medieval midwives did. Their practice was not based solely on ritual. It was based on presence. They watched, they listened. They knew the difference between a woman speaking from uncertainty and a woman speaking from the beginning of change. The test was a frame for something deeper, careful attention to the person before them. Even the onion test, which relied on the belief that scent could travel internally if the womb was open, contains a faint echo of real patterns. It is not true that scent travels through the body in the way medieval people imagined. But the belief was shaped by observation of something else, the relationship between breath, digestion, and emotion. They saw that the body's inner layers were connected, even if they did not understand how. Today, we know that hormones affect appetite, digestion, breath patterns, and the nervous system. The medieval explanation was symbolic, but the observations behind it were sincere. This is the heart of the matter. Medieval methods were not random. They were shaped through hundreds of years of shared experience, refined by midwives and healers who spent their lives listening to bodies. And it is here that we see the bridge between medieval practice and modern science. Science did not erase intuition. Science grew out of it. Before there were studies, there were stories. Before data, there was memory. Before measurement, there was noticing. The path from medieval pregnancy tests to modern ones is not a sudden jump from darkness to light. It is gradual, patient, human. In the 19th century, scientists began examining pregnancy through chemical reactions, noticing that urine from pregnant women interacted differently with certain compounds. In the early 20th century, the first reliable pregnancy test was developed using the biology of rabbits and, later, frogs, once again using the natural world to interpret the inner world. And then, in the late 20th century, we arrived at the familiar home tests, simple, fast, private, something a person can do alone in the quiet of their own space. But the emotional experience remains the same. There is always the moment before the result, the breath held, the heart listening, the quiet hope or quiet fear, the future resting in the space of a small, uncertain pause. And in that pause, we are closer to medieval life than we might expect. The medieval world looked for meaning in flame, grain, dreams, and the shifting warmth of the body. Today, we look for meaning in numbers, symbols on plastic, digital screens. But the desire is the same, to understand the body, to prepare the heart, to step toward the future with a little less uncertainty. What these ancient tests tell us is not how pregnancy was detected. What they tell us is how people cared. They show us a world where women were not alone in their waiting, where knowledge was shared in kitchens and beside hearths, where midwives sat with soft voices and attentive hands, where families watched time unfold together, slowly. There was tenderness in the waiting. There is still tenderness. Now, modern tests give clarity faster, but they do not remove the human experience that surrounds them. The wondering, the imagining, the soft protectiveness that appears long before certainty. And the medieval tests, even when scientifically inaccurate, understood something true. New life begins quietly, and the heart feels it before the mind knows it. To understand how we arrived at the modern pregnancy test, a small strip of paper or a digital screen offering an answer in minutes, we have to follow a long, quiet thread that stretches backward through time. And that thread begins not in laboratories, but in kitchens, gardens, candlelit rooms, and whispered conversations. It begins with midwives kneeling beside women in the soft light of early morning, with families waiting for seeds to sprout in bowls, with dreams interpreted under blanket, with candles flickering softly above the surface of still water. The medieval world did not have biochemical understanding, yet it held a deep truth, that the body changes when new life begins. And while the explanations of those changes were wrapped in symbolism and metaphor, the attentiveness behind them was real. People watched the body closely, not as observers from the outside, but as participants in their own unfolding experience. They noticed small patterns, subtle shifts in energy, breath, skin tone, posture, appetite. They learned to recognize early pregnancy, not through certainty, but through familiarity. For centuries, this knowledge lived in the hands and memories of midwives. Their expertise was not recorded in books, but carried in stories, touch, and presence. They learned to listen to the voice, to the breath, to the quiet tremor of uncertainty. In this way, The medieval world was surrounding pregnancy not with instruments, but with human closeness. And although science has changed the way pregnancy is detected, it has not replaced the emotional landscape that surrounds that moment. But slowly, the world changed. As the Renaissance unfolded, curiosity about the body deepened. Artists, scholars, physicians, and herbalists began to study the body more directly. Drawings of organs emerged. Libraries grew. The written memory of midwives, their techniques, their gestures, their ways of listening began to be collected and compared. Knowledge shifted from oral tradition into written record. Even so, pregnancy remained something invisible, something that could not be seen until the body changed outwardly. The desire for earlier certainty remained, and it continued to shape the search for new methods. Centuries passed. Cities expanded. Trade connected distant places. Herbs and knowledge moved across borders, and eventually, in the 19th century, science began to turn its attention toward the chemical nature of the body. Researchers studied urine not symbolically, but chemically. They discovered that urine contained compounds produced by the body as it changed. They noticed that certain conditions left markers in the liquid, and slowly, attention turned toward pregnancy. But science did not leap immediately to accuracy. The first scientific pregnancy tests were slow, delicate, and far from simple. In the early 20th century, researchers discovered that urine from a pregnant person contained hormones, especially one later known as HCG. And this hormone could produce a physical effect when injected into certain animals. That meant pregnancy could be detected, but only by harming an animal, and only in specialized laboratories. It was a step forward, but it was not yet something private, fast, or gentle. Even in this early scientific stage, the emotional experience surrounding pregnancy did not disappear. The waiting remained. The quiet remained. The hope remained. The science changed, but the heart did not. Then, as chemistry advanced, researchers found a way to create tests that reacted to HCG directly without requiring animals, without requiring laboratories, and from that discovery came the first home pregnancy test. A small object. A private moment. A result that arrived not over days or weeks, but in minutes. This was the culmination of many eras. The medieval tests looked outward to seeds, to flame, to dreams. The early scientific tests looked outward too, to animals, to lab reactions. But the modern test looks inward. It listens directly to the body. The same body people listened to centuries ago. And yet, even now, when a person holds a pregnancy test in their hand, there is always a pause. The breath catches, the world grows still for a moment. The result has not yet revealed itself, but something has already begun to shift inside. This pause is ancient. It is the same pause that existed when someone sat before a candle flame in a quiet room, waiting for the flame to flicker. The tools have changed. The waiting has not. The modern pregnancy test does not replace the emotional story. It simply offers clearer information. But the meaning of that information still belongs to the person receiving it. The body remains mysterious. Life remains mysterious. The heart continues to move in its own rhythm, separate from the certainty of results. This is why the history of pregnancy tests matters. Not because medieval methods were accurate, not because modern methods are perfect, but because the desire behind the tests reveals something universal. We want to understand what is happening inside us. We want to prepare for what will come. We want to hold the future gently, even before we know its shape. The path from sprouting seeds to digital displays is not the story of ignorance becoming knowledge. It is the story of human beings learning to listen more closely to the world, to the body, to one another. The medieval midwife listening to breath is not so different from the doctor reading a chart. The woman placing a key beneath her pillow is not so different from the woman sitting quietly while waiting for a result on a bathroom counter. Both are moments of reflection. Both are moments of vulnerability. Both are moments of hope. And so the history of pregnancy tests is not truly about methods. It is about care. Generations of care. Centuries of concern. A long lineage of hands, helping hands. The tests offered reassurance, guidance, and Most importantly, presence. Because when the question is a new life beginning within me? The answer is never only information. It is identity. It is future. It is change. From the flicker of a candle to the appearance of a line on a small white strip, the experience remains deeply human. Waiting in quiet, breathing slowly, listening for life. And so, when we look back now across centuries of kitchens and quiet rooms, across bowls of grain and flickering candles, across dreams and whispered interpretations, we see that the history of pregnancy tests is not simply the history of medicine. It is the history of how people tried to understand themselves. Long before science offered clear answers, there was still the heart. There was still waiting. There was still the quiet hope that something new might be beginning inside the body, long before the body was ready to show it. The medieval tests may seem distant or strange, but they were born from something familiar, the desire to know, to prepare, to gently reach toward the future. Even now, with modern tools that give answers quickly, the moment before knowing the pause, the held breath, the small stillness, that moment remains the same. Life begins quietly. Not with certainty, but with possibility. What has changed is only the method. What has stayed the same is the human heart. So perhaps the truest thread running through this story is not about grains or candles or metal. It is about care. Care shared in kitchens. Care given by midwives. Care passed down through generations. Care that continues today. Whether someone leans over a bowl of barley or waits quietly for the faint line on a test strip, the feeling is the same. Something in my life may be changing, and I am meeting that change slowly, gently, with hope. Thank you for spending this time here, listening, reflecting, breathing alongside the past. There is something calming about remembering that people have always searched for understanding, always held uncertainty in their hands, always found ways to care. If you are listening right now, I hope the room around you feels a little softer. I hope your breathing is steady. And I hope you carry with you the comfort that, across time, no one has ever truly waited alone. Thank you for being here today.